Hi there, and welcome to Connectivity Matters, a series of online discussions and field excursions to share knowledge and help build a common understanding of ecological connectivity and biodiversity conservation efforts underway in the Sea to Sky region of Southwest British Columbia. This series is part of the Wildlife Connectivity Project, a multi-year collaborative effort led by the Squamish Environment Society, the Howe Sound Biosphere Region Initiative Society, and by a coalition of local, regional, and provincial organizations who share a mandate for biodiversity conservation in our region. My name is Journeay, and I'll be your host for the series. I'm a director with the Squamish Environment Society and part of the Wildlife Connectivity Project team. The Squamish Environment Society, also known as Nature Squamish, is a community-based volunteer organization working in the Upper Howe Sound region since 1982. We're a registered charity and a federated member of BC Nature. Our mission is to seek understanding about the natural environment through monitoring and field-based investigations, and to share this knowledge with others to help inform conservation planning and stewardship initiatives in and around the Squamish Valley. Our partners, the Howe Sound Biosphere Region Initiative Society, are a registered charitable organization working in collaboration with the Squamish Nation and a broad range of local and regional planning authorities to advance shared goals for biodiversity conservation, sustainable development, and reconciliation with all nations and communities in the Howe Sound UNESCO Biosphere region. On behalf of our project team, I'll be sharing highlights of our work so far and the steps we're taking to support biodiversity conservation efforts in our region. The intent of this initial presentation is to help provide a context for other contributions to the series, both online discussions and field trips that will follow as part of this series. Finding Refuge is the theme for grassroots efforts led by the Squamish Environment Society to enhance ecological connectivity and biodiversity conservation in the Sea to Sky region of Southwest British Columbia. Our work is focused primarily in areas of fragmented habitat that occur outside existing protected areas. The Wildlife Connectivity Project represents the initial phase of this work. Our mission is to support land managers in safeguarding and restoring vulnerable terrestrial habitat and pathways of wildlife connectivity that are needed to increase the prospects of ecosystem resilience within the Howe Sound UNESCO Biosphere region and surrounding areas of the Sea to Sky corridor. At a local scale, our work supports frontline conservation planning efforts led by the Squamish Nation, regional district governments, member municipalities, and non-governmental organizations. The focus of this work is to enhance ecosystem resilience and wildlife connectivity through sustainable community planning, riparian area management, green infrastructure development, and sustainable forestry practices. Our commitment is to listen and learn from each other by building on the strengths of both Indigenous and Western ways of knowing, and the insights they offer in working toward a common set of goals and objectives. At a regional scale, our work is informed and contributes to land use planning and resource management activities led by provincial and federal agencies to advance broader goals of ecological connectivity and biodiversity conservation in British Columbia. Our approach and methods are aligned with guidelines established by the IUCN for biodiversity conservation through the identification and safeguarding of ecological connectivity networks across both local and regional scales of land governance. The presentation today will be between 35 and 40 minutes in length and is designed so that you can skip ahead to sections of interest. We encourage you to check out the additional background resources on our website. The first part of the presentation will set the stage for our work with an overview of project background, approach, goals, and intended outcomes. The following sections will focus on core activities that we are undertaking to support project partners in designing and implementing wildlife connectivity action plan for our region. These include the development of a regional biodiversity assessment to help identify high habitat areas that need to be connected, species distribution models that are used to delineate pathways of wildlife movement across local and regional scales of observation. And finally, but perhaps most importantly, elements of the participatory planning process that will focus on delineating and prioritizing wildlife corridors and identifying the corresponding land management actions that are needed to increase ecosystem resilience within the jurisdictional mandates of our project partners. This is a view from the town of Squamish looking south into the Howe Sound UNESCO Biosphere region, one of the most southern glacial fjords in North America. As shown in the inset map, Howe Sound is situated next to Metro Vancouver, the third largest metropolitan center in Canada with a population of more than 2.6 million people. Nonetheless, the region remains wild in many respects due to steep, rugged terrain that surrounds the inlet and limited water access along its western shore. The lands and waters of Howe Sound encompass more than 2,000 square kilometers of interconnected marine and terrestrial ecosystems that extend from the seafloor to the height of land in the coast mountains of southwest British Columbia. As many as 4,500 unique species of animals and plants are known to occur within this area, including rare glass sponge reefs once thought to be extinct and only recently discovered in the waters of Howe Sound. It's one of the more biologically diverse regions in Canada and recognized internationally as an area of global ecological significance. Lands and waters of this region are in a constant state of change and have sustained the Coast Salish people since retreat of glaciers from this area more than 10,000 years ago. Over this time, Indigenous communities have lived through and learned from dramatic shifts in regional environmental conditions related to uplift and active mountain building. Insights and knowledge gained through this process are embedded in principles of resilience and practices of environmental stewardship that have been carried forward to this day by the Squamish Nation. They have never ceded or surrendered title to their lands, the rights to the resources, or the power to make sustainable land use decisions. And they have continued in their role as guardians of both marine and terrestrial ecosystems in their traditional territory. In the wake of environmental degradation caused by the cumulative effects of industrial development and resource extraction in this region, the Squamish Nation was part of a sustained and collaborative effort to recover endangered marine ecosystems within the Howe Sound. At the brink of collapse in the late 1970s, the recovery of marine ecosystems over the last 40 years has been both spectacular and inspiring, with increasing populations of forage fish supporting the return of sea lions, dolphins, and whales into the region. In 2021, Howe Sound was designated as UNESCO Biosphere Region with a mission to advance 4 primary areas of interest. One, to support education, research, and monitoring of both terrestrial and marine ecosystems within the region, to focus efforts on biodiversity conservation, both in the terrestrial and marine realms, to support sustainable development at the community level within Howe Sound, and reconciliation with First Nations at the community level. The Wildlife Connectivity Project contributes to these goals with a focus on ecological connectivity and biodiversity conservation of terrestrial ecosystems in our region. It also provides an opportunity to listen and learn from the Squamish Nation members about environmental changes that have occurred in this area, and to work together in exploring opportunities to safeguard vulnerable habitat and pathways of wildlife connectivity, both for their own sake and for the benefit of future generations. As shown in the inset map, our work encompasses a regional assessment of biodiversity values for the broader sea to sky region, shown in a lighter shade of green, and more focused work to support biodiversity conservation planning within the Howe Sound Biosphere region itself, shown in a darker shade of green. It's been said that we are the eyes of the Earth looking back at itself. In the next few slides, we'll be using satellite imagery to help orient us to the physical geography of the region, the history of environmental change, and the motivation for our work on ecological connectivity. The image shown on this screen is a zoomed-in view of the northern Howe Sound Biosphere region, which is situated at the confluence of 5 major drainage systems in the southern coast mountains. As shown in the bar chart on the left, about 19% of terrestrial ecosystems within the broader biosphere region are currently situated within conservation areas that meet IUCN guidelines for environmental protection. These include legally designated parks, ecological reserves, and areas managed to advance other effective conservation measures, or OECMs. An additional 13% of terrestrial lands are represented by high elevation forest and alpine ecosystems that surround core areas and that are managed in ways compatible with provincial guidelines for sustainable resource development. These include lands set aside for the conservation of old growth forests, wildlife and critical habitat values, and ungulate winter ranges. The remaining 52% of terrestrial ecosystems occur in transitional areas at mid and low slope elevations that have experienced various levels of landscape disturbance over the years. This is a false color satellite image of the same area showing the geographic extent, intensity, and cumulative impacts of our human footprint in this area. The accompanying video sequence that's playing in the background is a dynamic model of landscape change developed by TerraDAP that measures annual changes in the scope and intensity of landscape disturbance over the last 40 years. The results of this model help to monitor and assess regional patterns of habitat fragmentation and biodiversity loss. Darker shades of green represent relatively undisturbed wildland habitat, mostly in protected core areas and surrounding buffer zones at higher elevations. Lighter shades of green represent timber harvest areas in various states of recovery and wildlife areas that have either been converted to agricultural land use or permanently lost urban growth and development in the valley bottoms. Patterns of landscape disturbance and habitat fragmentation are primarily concentrated along northerly trending areas of urban development and timber harvesting adjacent to major river drainage systems. This is an important point to keep in mind, as we know from previous studies that regionally significant pathways of ecological connectivity generally trend east-west or northeast-southwest across major river systems in this region. So what is an ecological connectivity network and why does it matter? As shown in the sketch on the right, networks of ecological connectivity are defined by linear pathways and stepping stone corridors that allow for the movement of animals and plants between patches of higher quality habitat that have been fragmented by the cumulative impacts of human disturbance. These networks of connectivity occur across local and regional scales and are the lifeblood of a healthy and fully functional ecosystem. Identifying these connectivity networks on the ground and the corresponding land management actions that are needed to safeguard them are foundational strategies for mitigating the underlying drivers of biodiversity loss and for enhancing the longer-term prospects of ecosystem resilience in a changing climate. The focus of our project is on modeling and mapping local ecological connectivity networks within the Alcouts and Howe Sound biosphere region and their linkage to broader regional networks that support the movement of threatened wildlife species within the Sea to Sky region of Southwest British Columbia. Our work is framed around answering three core questions. What needs to be connected, connectivity for whom, and to what end? For the first question, we focus on identifying wildland habitat core areas with high levels of ecosystem integrity that support the life cycle needs of animals that are resilient to the cumulative effects of environmental change and that have the potential to be preserved. In terms of the functional components of connectivity, our focus is on wildlife species who need safe passage from one place to another across the landscape to meet their needs for food, water, shelter, and reproduction. The purpose of this work is to safeguard wildlife corridors. This is done by establishing clearly defined geographic areas that are managed over the long term to protect, maintain, or restore pathways of ecological connectivity for the broadest possible range of native species. Our work with the Squamish Nation is guided by a collaboration agreement that is aligned with principles of engagement outlined in the Squamish Nation Strategic Plan of 2026 and by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Our collaboration is framed around the principle of two-eyed seeing, which is about learning to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, to see from the other eye with the strengths of mainstream knowledge and ways of knowing, and to focus both eyes on advancing shared goals and objectives for the benefit of all. Indigenous knowledge, in the context of this project, is understood to be the cumulative body of practices, beliefs, and insights that are gained by living on the land. This knowledge is handed down through generations by cultural transmission to help promote a shared understanding about the relationship of all living things with one another and with their environment. This understanding is not separable from the knowledge keeper, nor is it divisible from the environment in which it's embedded. These are very important principles and concepts to bear in mind. This component of the project will be led by Squamish Nation members in ways that support implementation of their Kaitamewa or sacred land use plan. As mentioned earlier in this work, this builds on an extensive process of community engagement that supports ongoing work to delineate pathways of wildlife connectivity within the region. The Western science component of the project, shown on the right-hand side of this slide, will be led by the Squamish Environment Society, following IUCN guidelines for enhancing our understanding of ecological connectivity, using a blend of Earth observation, field-based studies, and predictive or analytical models. These models assess how different environmental variables influence the use of terrestrial habitat by wildlife species at local and/or regional scales. The variables used in this study reflect both historical trends of environmental change derived from a regional assessment and more localized environmental conditions documented through a combination of Earth observation and field-based studies. Wildlife occurrences include regional compilations of time series data for representative species. These two streams of information, the environmental variables and wildlife occurrences, are then combined using species distribution models that look for correlations between the occurrence of wildlife at a particular location and the corresponding environmental variables at that location. The outputs of the models are used to predict other areas on the landscape where we might expect to see similar characteristics of habitat suitability and occupancy by representative wildlife species. In this study, we're using a nested hierarchy of distribution models to piece together networks of wildlife connectivity that we hope will be relevant for conservation planning at all scales. Insights gained from the perspectives of both Indigenous and Western ways of knowing help identify networks of ecological connectivity that are essential to advance common goals. We're at the very beginning of our learning path and grateful for the opportunity to work with Squamish Nation members in developing approaches and methods of equitable collaboration that support broader efforts toward reconciliation with Indigenous communities in our region. The seeds of this project have been sown by many hands over the years, and I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge these important contributions. Protection of vulnerable wildlife habitat and pathways of wildlife movement were identified by the Squamish Nation in 2001 as part of their Kaitamewa or sacred land use planning process. It remains a primary goal of the 2022 Squamish Nation strategic plan and a connecting thread for ongoing land use planning within the traditional territory of the Squamish Nation. The district of Squamish, shown here on the map with a darker shade of green centered around the town of Squamish, began mapping sensitive ecosystems within valley bottom regions at the head of Howe Sound in 2015. As part of this effort, environmental planners recognized the need to both identify and protect wildlife corridors and vulnerable habitat, and to work toward a broader biodiversity conservation strategy. Wildlife connectivity and the protection of sensitive ecosystems was introduced as a policy goal in the 2017 official community plan. The Squamish Nation and the District of Squamish entered into a partnership in 2022 to jointly manage community forests on lands of shared interest adjacent to the community of Squamish, shown in a lighter shade of green. The resource management plan is based on principles of sustainable forestry that seek a balance between economic, social, environmental, and cultural values. The Squamish-Lillooet Regional District, whose area is shown in a stippled pattern on this map, also recognize the need to protect sensitive ecosystems and safeguard pathways of ecological connectivity as part of their 2018 regional growth strategy. The Squamish-Lillooet Regional District, or SLRD, is a regional planning authority. They're responsible for the provision of services to communities in rural areas and the development of overarching policies that guide growth management and land governance by member municipalities within the Sea to Sky corridor. While there's clear policy guidance on the importance of biodiversity conservation planning and the protection of ecological corridors in this region, partners have expressed frustration and concern over their ability to carry out the supporting assessment work that's needed to map and prioritize wildlife corridors in a coordinated way across local and regional scales of land governance. The Wildlife Connectivity Project was initiated by the Squamish Environment Society in 2021 to help address this need. An initial study helped articulate the scope of work and the partnerships needed to co-design and implement a connectivity action plan for our region. In 2022 and 23, we embarked on a more comprehensive scoping study in collaboration with the Howe Sound Biosphere Region Initiative Society. And in that process, we learned from what others have done to establish connectivity action plans in BC and surrounding regions of the Pacific Northwest. And we began the hard work of establishing the working relationships that will be needed to move this work forward into the future. Our project contributes to broader goals and objectives of the Entumut or Unity Plan developed by the Alcaltz Howe Sound UNESCO Biosphere Region. This is an overarching strategy to help guide the management of lands and waters in a more holistic way. Finally, our work is informed by and contributes to assessments of terrestrial ecosystems and related planning initiatives led by the province of BC and others working in the Sea to Sky region. These include ongoing assessments of critical wildlife habitat and species at risk, the cumulative effects framework, which helps monitor changes to environmental, social, and economic values based on the combined effects of human disturbance and climate change, the Stewardship Baseline Objectives Platform, an online management tool which provides guidance on how well conservation management objectives are being met through various policy and land use initiatives in the region, and also visitor use management strategies that are currently under development for areas that are experiencing the negative impacts of outdoor recreational tourism in our region. The longer-term success of this project hinges on our ability to work effectively across cultural and jurisdictional boundaries and to build the capacities needed to support biodiversity conservation planning on an ongoing basis. To this end, we've developed a governance framework to help guide our work together. It expresses our commitment to listen and learn from each other and to collaborate in ways that advance collective goals of ecological connectivity and biodiversity conservation. A steering committee, which includes representation from the Squamish Nation, local regional planning authorities, non-governmental organizations, and provincial federal agencies, serves as the overarching guide to this project. Steering committee members provide leadership on strategic conservation goals and the base of evidence required to support planning and policy development across local and regional scales. A technical working group of more than 25 researchers and practitioners from academic, public, and private sector organizations provide input on overall approach and methodologies used in the project. The project team acts in a support capacity and is responsible for operational aspects of planning, budgeting, and oversight of tasks related to biodiversity assessment and the support of conservation planning activities led by project partners. This is an overview of the roadmap for our project. Tasks and related activities are staged within each of 3 fiscal year cycles and build on the recommendations stemming from our initial scoping study. Each stage of the project represents a scope of work with discrete milestones and deliverables. In this presentation, we'll be focusing on work carried out so far and immediate next steps in working toward a wildlife connectivity action plan for our region. As part of stage 1, we carried out a longitudinal assessment of environmental change using a framework of indicators developed in partnership with TerraDAP, a nonprofit research organization focusing on the monitoring, analysis, and protection of dynamic landscape change to support conservation efforts in the Cascadia region of the Pacific Northwest. Indicators developed as part of this work monitor historical trends in habitat loss, ecosystem integrity, wildlife connectivity, and natural capital over the last 40 years. Model outputs are used to identify hotspot areas of biodiversity loss, habitat core areas, and habitat suitability for regional umbrella species. In addition, we're in the process of developing more detailed species distribution models to help identify and map wildlife corridors at scales that are relevant to conservation planning at a local scale. We are just beginning stage 2 of the project, which involves a more in-depth analysis of environmental values within wildlife habitat areas and connectivity pathways that are relevant to project partners. Outputs will be used to co-design an integrated network of wildlife corridors and to identify specific land management actions that are effective in protecting, restoring, and maintaining critical habitat and pathways of movement within our region. The following slides provide an overview of our approach and methods and initial findings of our work so far, with a focus on the following 3 things. One, we'll give an overview of the methods and results of our regional biodiversity assessment. Secondly, we'll focus on the species distribution models that are currently underdeveloped to assess functional characteristics of connectivity at both the local and regional scale. And finally, we'll look at the methods of adaptive land management that we're developing to help bridge the gap between knowledge and actions related to the development of the Wildlife Connectivity Action Plan. The first step in our assessment is to identify which areas on the landscape need to be connected to enhance ecosystem resilience. This is an ecosystem-based approach to connectivity that focuses on the identification of habitat core and buffer zones that are characterized by one, terrestrial ecosystems of high structural integrity that are resilient to the cumulative effects of environmental change. Secondly, wildlife habitat with high functional capacities that are needed to support the life cycle needs of native species, both large and small. And finally, existing or proposed conservation protection measures that have the potential for longer-term preservation. As mentioned earlier, the identification of areas with high ecosystem integrity and habitat value is based on results of a regional biodiversity assessment we carried out in partnership with TerraDAP. The map on the right shows in lighter shades of green, shows the area encompassed by the TerraDAP model for Cascadia. It includes an assessment of terrestrial ecosystems and representative umbrella species. The terrestrial ecosystems include both temperate forests that occur at lower level elevations within the Salish Sea and the sea to sky corridor. Wet and dry montane forest ecosystems that occur largely within our study region within the sea to sky area. And also grassland and shrub steppe ecosystems that occur in drier areas of the interior Columbia and Okanagan Plateau regions to the east of us. Also included in this assessment, and what we'll focus on in a moment, is an assessment of habitat suitability for regionally significant umbrella species, including grizzly bear, wolverine, Pacific fisher, and Canada lynx. The TerraDAP model leverages input from wildlife ecologists and the latest in remote sensing and cloud-based computing technologies to accomplish 3 primary objectives. The first is to monitor and assess environmental trends over a 40-year period. This is important as land managers need a high level of situational awareness about the underlying drivers of environmental change to anticipate future risks and opportunities to help prioritize land management actions at a particular location. Secondly, the TerraDAP model provides the capacity to project future climate range shifts. These are important to help land managers anticipate range shifts in ecosystems and to identify both climate refugia and also pathways of connectivity that will be preserved in spite of the changes in climate. The outputs of both the monitoring and future projections are then used to support the prioritization of conservation strategies. And this is really the handoff point between the TerraDAP platform and regional and local planning initiatives like ours that are focused more on the development of conservation planning strategies. As part of our work with TerraDAP, we developed a framework of indicators that monitor spatial and temporal patterns of environmental change through the lens of both ecosystem risk and resilience. I won't go into the details of each of them, but you get a sense of what we've included as part of the indicator framework on the right-hand side of the screen. The patterns of environmental change for each of these indicators are represented using a combination of raster-based maps with a ground resolution of 30 by 30 meters and indicator charts that summarize trends over time for a given area of interest. To give you a sense of how we're using these indicators in support of our project objectives, we'll focus initially on indicators of ecosystem threats shown on this map, which reflect a broad range of land use activities that increase the resistance to movement for wildlife species over time. These include urban growth and development, forest thinning and harvest activities, and the impacts of historic wildfire hazard events that have occurred in our region. The cumulative effects of these threats are shown in shades of red for current conditions on this map. The darker colors reflect higher intensities of landscape disturbance. Collectively, these factors limit the ability of wildlife species to move freely across the landscape, and in some cases, can create physical barriers to movement. The physical threats related to urban growth and development and infrastructure development are compounded by the effects of recreational tourism. As shown in this slide, an extensive network of resource roads and trail systems are allowing more and more people to travel into previously remote areas of the backcountry. Increased levels of recreational tourism are known to have a significant impact on wildlife behavior and movement patterns across the landscape, especially for those species that are less tolerant of human presence. More than 40 environmental predictor variables are used in the Teradata model to assess overall ecosystem integrity at a given location. These include measures of environmental conditions based on Landsat multispectral satellite data, normalized climate variables like precipitation and temperature, and physical features of the landscape, including topography, hydrology, and local soil conditions. The map on this slide is an example of environmental predictor variables derived from satellite imagery. The assessment is based on a normalized difference vegetation index, or NDVI, which uses sensor data to measure the extent to which plants are absorbing solar radiation as a source of energy to support the process of photosynthesis at a given location on the ground. The darker shades of green in this slide indicate habitat areas with dense vegetation and higher levels of ecosystem function. As you can see, these occur primarily on south-facing slopes at low and mid elevations that are exposed to higher levels of solar radiation, and in areas that are known to have higher levels of soil moisture. The full suite of environmental variables are interpreted based on input from landscape ecologists who are familiar with the details of terrestrial ecosystems in this region. Our assessment of overall ecosystem integrity accounts for both the intrinsic characteristics of the natural environment to support structural connectivity and underlying biodiversity threats that increase the resistance for movement of wildlife species across the landscape. The patterns shown in various shades of green on this map represent relative degrees of ecosystem integrity for terrestrial habitat under current conditions. The darker shades of green indicate areas of high and very high habitat suitability. Again, these are in higher elevations, largely protected currently by a range of conservation measures. Lighter shades of green represent moderate and considerable levels of habitat suitability in areas that have been impacted by different types of landscape disturbance over time. Regions shown in shades of pale green and white represent the transitional zones in valley bottoms where habitat has either been permanently lost to urban growth and development, converted to agricultural land uses, or substantially fragmented as a result of these activities. As mentioned earlier, the outputs of these models are used to help identify areas of higher habitat value that need to be connected as part of a wildlife corridor. The second component of our work focuses on functional characteristics of habitat use and connectivity for the broadest possible range of native species in our area. Focal species are a select group of animals and/or plants chosen for the purpose of evaluating strategies to enhance the functional characteristics of the landscape. They're selected because they have ecological traits or fulfill specific roles in their habitat that make them important indicators of biodiversity and or ecosystem health. It's assumed that by meeting the needs of these focal species, planners will also be developing strategies that benefit other wildlife populations that occupy and move through similar habitat types. Again, the focus is less on the behaviors of individual species and more on the functional characteristics of the habitat they rely on. We talked earlier about the outputs from Pterodap, which give us habitat suitability for larger carnivores. Our work is also focusing on other keystone and indicator species that are relevant at a local scale. We'll focus initially in the next couple of slides on the regional elements of functional connectivity, and then we'll focus more in the final few slides on work we're doing to identify more localized patterns of habitat use and connectivity. Regionally significant species used in this study include the umbrella species models developed by Pterodap, as well as range distribution models for mountain goat and Roosevelt elk that have been developed in our region by the BC Wildlife Service. The combination of regionally significant carnivore and ungulate species provides an ability to identify home ranges at a very large scale and to identify connectivity pathways that are required to connect these areas over the landscape. Here's an example of some preliminary results for a composite model we've developed to assess functional connectivity for these regionally significant carnivore and ungulate species. So this model, or this map, I should say, combines individual habitat suitability results from both Pterodap and the provincial models that we mentioned earlier. The darker shades of green represent areas of high habitat suitability in which multiple wildlife species are likely to occur, while lighter shades of green on this map represent areas with lower habitat suitability. These are areas that have largely been fragmented by ongoing landscape disturbance at lower elevations and the valley bottoms. Although preliminary, these results are nonetheless very encouraging. They correlate well with previously published models of habitat use and connectivity for grizzly bear. And they're very consistent with models that are being developed at the regional scale to help prioritize biodiversity conservation efforts in BC and other parts of Canada. While these regional patterns are important to establish the backbone of connectivity for the region, it's also important to be able to zoom in to a finer scale of connectivity that's nested at the scale that's relevant for conservation planning at a local scale. And so for this, we've been focusing our work on keystone and indicator species that have a significant role in maintaining ecological functions and whose effect is disproportionate relative to their abundance. These are species that are sensitive to environmental changes at a local scale and therefore relevant to conservation planning efforts at that scale. The development of these more localized species distribution models is being led by Catherine Andy, and she'll be giving a presentation later in this series. So I'll encourage you to have a look at that for more details on the models that we're developing and the supporting methodologies. For this study, Kate's using wildlife occurrence data compiled from the Global Biodiversity Information Framework, GBIF, which is an international network of data sources that are compiled. These include research-grade observations from iNaturalist and supporting information from the BC Conservation Data Center. The collection compiled for this study includes more than 22,000 observations, representing 76 unique mammal, 16 amphibian, and 11 reptile species. Of these, 7 are red listed species and considered threatened, endangered, or at risk of becoming extinct. 17 species in the collection are blue listed and particularly sensitive to and vulnerable to the impacts of human activity. The majority of species in the collection are yellow listed and considered currently secure, but of concern in areas that are experiencing increased human activity. The remaining 14 of the species in the collection are what are considered exotic species. These are animals that have been moved beyond their natural range because of human activity. And so here's a summary of those the different types of species included in this study. This map is the first in a series of range distribution models that we're developing to help delineate patterns of habitat use and wildlife connectivity for project partners. We chose to start by investigating patterns of habitat use by black bears based on correlations with high value vegetated cover, proximity to fish-bearing streams, and other important environmental predictor variables. We chose black bears as a keystone species because they are a wide-ranging animal with patterns of habitat use that vary with time of year and food source. Like grizzly bear, the black bear is found in alpine areas during berry season, in forested habitat at mid elevations, and along riparian airing corridors at lower elevations in search of fish and high nutrient plants. They help maintain the structure of an ecological community and determine the types and numbers of various other species that are likely to occur in the region. However, unlike grizzly, black bear are more tolerant of human presence and able to move between patches of habitat in transitional and fragmented landscapes. Through their habitats of hunting, foraging, and fishing, bears have a significant influence on the health of both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. They spread plant and berry seeds in their droppings, and they redistribute marine-derived nitrogen and other important soil nutrients by dragging salmon and other fish into forested areas surrounding riparian networks. As such, the life cycle patterns of black bears help to delineate fundamental patterns of habitat use and movement for other related wildlife communities. The map shown on this slide is helping to illuminate the very beginnings of our local connectivity network, this one for black bear. The darker shades of green on this map represent areas of high habitat use in which black bear and other related species are likely to occur, while the lighter shades of green represent areas of lower habitat suitability. And as you look at the map, you can see that we're starting to identify these local connectivity networks. And as you follow those networks into the valley bottom, you can begin to see the elements of both continuous linear landscape corridors, stepping stone corridors comprised of smaller patches of habitat within areas of fragmentation. And also clear on this map are both the habitat core areas and surrounding buffer zones that will be included as part of wildlife corridor networks. I should mention that we're just at the stage now of completing the species distribution models. The next step in the process for us will be to use the outputs of these models to actually start to identify connectivity networks through the use of least cost paths modeling techniques. We caution that these are very preliminary results and likely to change as we continue to refine the models. But we're very encouraged by the initial results of this model for black bear, and as you'll see in Kate's presentation later on in this series, similar patterns of connectivity for other relevant species of concern in our region. Okay, so in the last few slides, we'll shift our focus from the analysis of habitat suitability and connectivity to the steps that we're putting in place to help bridge the gap between understanding and action. The goal of this work is to establish clearly defined geographic areas, wildlife corridors that are managed over the long term to protect, maintain, and or restore pathways of ecological connectivity for the broadest possible range of native species. Again, the map on, or the figure on the right kind of highlights the areas that will be the focus of a participatory planning process that will go on for the next year and a half, leading to the co-development of a wildlife connectivity action plan for our region. We can't predict the future, but we can certainly plan for it. And our intent is to develop the capacities needed to carry out this work in the broader context of an adaptive land management framework, so that conservation measures can be monitored and updated on an ongoing basis as conditions change or as new information becomes available. Adaptive land management, as many of you know, is a way of taking care of the land in the face of uncertainty through a process of assessment and planning. It's a process that's based on the best available knowledge at a given point in time, an understanding of environmental change over time, and also that reflects the strategic goals and objectives of a place and its people. Important to point out on this slide is that the scope of work for our current project is focused primarily on the initial planning phase of adaptive land management, which includes the assessment and design components. And in this presentation, we've looked at the outputs of our initial assessment of biodiversity and wildlife connectivity. We've also completed an initial workshop to identify goals and intended outcomes for the connectivity action plan. The next steps in the planning process will be to work with project partners to co-design a network of wildlife corridors across that encompass both local and regional scales, and to continue to refine our wildlife connectivity models. The outputs of this work will lead to the co-design and development of wildlife corridors. These will then provide a basis for identifying and prioritizing land management actions that can be considered by our project partners and that can be implemented within their jurisdictional mandates. And finally, to develop recommendations and policy options for implementing that strategy into the future. So just wrapping up, we have in this presentation looked at the outputs of our work so far, encompassing the regional biodiversity assessment and habitat modeling to try and tease out patterns of structural and functional connectivity in the region. And we've just begun the process of participatory planning with our partners. Work ahead of us in stage 2 and stage 3 will focus on more detailed connectivity modeling to pull out specific corridor networks. It will include the steps I mentioned in the previous slide of both identifying and prioritizing wildlife corridors and the elements within those corridors that need to be conserved and protected. Together, this work is helping to build the capacities needed to advance broader goals and objectives of biodiversity conservation and ecological connectivity across local, regional, and national scales. The elements that we are paying attention to include the Kaitmeo, or Sacred Land Use Plan, under development by the Squamish Nation. Together with Wildlife Strategy, currently under development by the province of BC, along with the draft Biodiversity and Ecosystem Health Framework. Canada's 23 Biodiversity Conservation Strategy lays out some broad overarching goals, policy goals, that are framed within the context of the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Each of these policy frameworks provide guidance for the work that we're doing here at the local scale. With that, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to share the initial results of our wildlife connectivity project. This is an ongoing process of learning, assessment, and planning that will continue to evolve over the next couple of years. We welcome your feedback on approach and methodology and are open to exploring opportunities for collaboration, especially with those who may be willing to share knowledge about patterns of environmental change and ecological connectivity in our region, and or those who may be further down the road in developing wildlife connectivity action plans and are willing to share their insights and expertise. Finally, we'd like to thank our project partners, collaborators, and funders for their ongoing support and contributions in helping to move this project forward. We're grateful for their insights and the capacities they each bring to our project. If you have any questions or suggestions or ideas that you'd like to share with us, or if you could identify opportunities of collaboration, please contact us at wildlife@squamishenvironment.ca. So that wraps up our overview presentation of the Wildlife Connectivity Project. Up next is a presentation by Catherine Andy that will provide an overview of localized species distribution models that she's been developing over the last few months, and a sneak preview at some of the initial study results. A recording of Kate's session along with the session here today will be posted on our website along with background materials, and we encourage you to check those out over time. And with that, again, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you down the road. Take care. Bye.